lies your real fear?
Love that poem. Michael Servetus lived during the 1500s, and he was a doctor. He, in fact, was a medical researcher at that time, even though medicine looked very different in that day. And he is credited with discovering the pulmonary system in the human body. He was a brilliant person, brilliant practitioner who discovered the pulmonary system and shared lots of that information with his colleagues at the time. And he was also a theologian, even though he wasn't teaching at a university, even though he wasn't, classically trained in theology. He wasn't even a minister or pastor at that time. He was a theologian, and he started to write books on his theology. And one of those books, which has become an important one for us because of our history and our identity, was called On the Errors of the Trinity. He was one of the first Unitarians living in the Reformation period. This is something about our faith that if you may not be familiar with, but we go back some ways. We go back at least to the Reformation and probably before that. But during the Reformation, Unitarian ideas started to catch hold, and more people started to advocate for them. And Servetus was one of the first to do so. The officials at that time were not thrilled. Servetus thought that there was so much sort of vitality in terms of what was happening intellectually. A lot of different parts of faith were being challenged and rethought, and he thought that the Reformation might be one of those times when a new idea, such as the Trinity being an error, would catch hold, and people would be like, oh yeah, right, the Trinity, we don't believe in that. Well, that's not what happened. Instead, Servetus was chased between Catholic countries and Calvinist countries. His life is fascinating to read about. He's frequently escaping through windows and narrowly evading the courts and police. At one point, he writes a book, and this is after On the Errors of the Trinity, but he writes a book called The Restoration of Christianity. And that book is a critique of Calvin and Calvin's ideas about Christianity and how Christianity should be practiced. And that book is sort of the last straw. It is banned everywhere. People are actively searching for copies in order to burn it. They want to get rid of it, just, stamp it out from history. They want that so much that finally they capture Servetus. They strap a copy of that book to his thigh, and they burn him alive with it. 2 copies remained. 2 copies. And I think part of the interesting thing about, banning books today is like, well, you just go on Amazon and get it, right? Not so much back then, there was more of a chance that you might actually be successful in repressing that kind of knowledge. Nonetheless, 2 copies of that book survived. And if you're at all interested in this, there is a book called Out of the Flames. That is my contribution to our banned book communion today. And it traces the history. It's kind of like an adventure novel tracing the labyrinthine path that these books went on, from private collections to libraries to lots of different places in order to arrive intact today. So, we're celebrating banned books today, and that isn't to say that all banned books deserve celebration, right? There are many banned books that are quite problematic. And I think that that's something that we need to acknowledge, because it's not that banned books are just always fantastic and in the right and going to match up with our values. Mein Kampf is a book that has been banned at different times in different places. And so we need to be honest about that reality. And even though some of those books are ones that have been banned, I think that it is important to think about what banning does and to maybe acknowledge that that's not the best way to handle books that we disagree with. There is a book in the UUA that has sort of been circulating around General Assembly and has been commented on quite a bit by ministers and by different groups of Unitarian Universalists. It really challenges the UUA's approaches to LGBTQI issues, as well as its commitment to anti-racism. I think it's a problematic book in a lot of ways. I disagree with it on deep, fundamental levels. I don't even think it's well written, and I don't think that the arguments are very sound in it. I think it's cherry-picked. I think there's a lot of problems with that book. And my response to anybody who would come up and say, "What should I do with this book?" would be, if you want to, read it. Let me know what you think about it. Let's talk about it. Let's bring up the parts in it that are problematic. Address those. I think that that goes deeply into our faith tradition. I think that that touches upon our values of the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, that we celebrate with one another the ability to read and think freely and arrive at a more just, loving, compassionate place, not through pretending something doesn't exist or trying to eliminate it from knowledge, but rather understanding what it's about, talking about it, reasoning about it, feeling our way into it, and then coming out the other side in a more whole, loving, and just place. This is why we today engage in our banned book communion. And so, if you have a book that you would like to talk about, you are welcome to come up to the microphone and say a little bit about how that book inspired you. Please try not to make it a whole sermon. Just a paragraph, just a couple of lines about why, what the book is about and why you think it is important. And I promise we won't be here all day, but we will get to celebrate some of these books. Right.